I always thought I had everything figured out. At 37, I was where I wanted to be, senior project manager at a prestigious architecture firm in Boston, owner of a dream apartment overlooking the harbor, and proud driver of a sleek new Audi that I'd treated myself to after my last promotion. My life ran like clockwork: meetings, deadlines, weekend brunches with friends, and the occasional date that never seemed to go anywhere. But I was fine with that. Independence was my comfort zone. Then Costa Rica happened. It was supposed to be a 2-week escape from a particularly brutal winter. I'd envisioned myself lounging on pristine beaches with a book in one hand and a cocktail. In the other, maybe trying some surfing lessons and exploring rainforests. What I hadn't planned was meeting Miguel, the charming local guide with infectious laughter and eyes that somehow matched the exact shade of the Caribbean Sea. Just a vacation fling, I told myself as I boarded my flight home. Tan and relaxed, in a way I hadn't been in years. Something to remember when I'm buried under project specs next month. But life had other plans. 6 weeks later, I sat on the edge of my bathtub, staring at 2 pink lines on a plastic stick while my heart attempted to escape through my throat. I took another test, and another, all with the same result. I was pregnant. The irony wasn't lost on me. After years of being careful, of prioritizing my career over relationships, of watching friends struggle with fertility issues while I secretly wondered if I'd waited too long, here I was, pregnant from a vacation hookup. At 37, my first call was to my younger sister, Melissa. "You're what?" Her voice pitched high enough to make me pull the phone away from my ear. "Pregnant," I repeated, the words still feeling foreign on my tongue. "About 6 weeks, I think." "Is it that guy from Costa Rica? What was his name? Manuel?" "Miguel," I corrected. And yes, it would be his, but Mel, I haven't told him. I'm not sure I will. There was a long pause. "Well, you know what you need to do, right? You can't possibly be thinking of keeping it." The word "it" made something inside me bristle, already protective. That was unexpected. "I don't know what I'm thinking yet," I said honestly. "I just found out. Karen, be realistic. You're single, you work 60-hour weeks, and you've never even mentioned wanting kids. Plus, Mom and Dad would completely freak out." That was true. My traditional Polish-American parents had very specific ideas about the proper order of things. Marriage first, then children. Preferably with a nice Catholic boy from a good family. They'd been disappointed enough when I prioritized my education and career over settling down. An out-of-wedlock baby would be scandalous in their circles. "I can't make decisions based on what Mom and Dad might think," I said, more firmly than I felt. "Well, you're coming for Sunday dinner this weekend, right? Don't say anything to them until you've had time to think. Promise me," I promised, though I knew Melissa would tell them herself within hours. My sister had never been able to keep a secret, especially from our mother. They spoke daily, sharing every detail of their lives while I maintained a more independent, some might say distant, relationship with our parents. After hanging up, I wandered into my living room and stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows that had been the main selling point of my apartment. The Boston Harbor stretched before me, boats gliding across the water, their wakes creating rippling patterns that seemed to mirror my turbulent thoughts. I placed a hand on my still flat stomach. There was a life growing inside me. A possibility I had never seriously considered was now the only thing I could think about. By the time Sunday rolled around, I had made exactly 0 progress on deciding what to do. The architecture plans for the boutique hotel my team was designing sat untouched on my dining table. Emails piled up. I called in sick for the first time. In 3 years, spending my days alternating between research on single motherhood and staring blankly at my harbor view. My parents' house in Dorchester hadn't changed since I was a child. The same heavy furniture, the same faded family photos, the same smell of my mother's Polish cooking. I paused on the front steps, drawing in a deep breath before ringing the doorbell. From inside, I could hear the familiar sounds of the Red Sox game on the television and my father's occasional commentary. My mother opened the door, immediately pulling me into an embrace that smelled of garlic and her signature floral perfume. "Karen, you're late. Everyone's already started eating." "Sorry, Mom. Traffic was terrible." A lie. I'd been sitting in my car around the corner for 20 minutes, rehearsing possible conversations in my head. As predicted, my entire family was already seated around the dining table, my father at the head, still focused on the portable TV he'd set up to avoid missing the game. My sister and her husband, John, on one side with their twin 10-year-old boys, and 2 empty chairs on the other side where my mother and I would sit. The boys were engrossed in some handheld game, while John nodded politely in response to whatever my father was saying about the Red Sox's pitching lineup. "Look who finally decided to join us," Melissa announced, giving me a look that confirmed my suspicion. She'd told them. My father muted the game long enough to grunt a greeting before returning, his attention to the screen. Mom bustled around, placing a heaping plate of golumki, stuffed cabbage rolls, in front of me. "You look tired, Karolina," she said, using my full Polish name as she always did when concerned or disapproving. "Are you working too much again? I tell you, all work and no life is not good for a woman your age." I caught Melissa's eye across the table. She gave a tiny shake of her head. So she hadn't told them after all. I felt a surge of gratitude toward my usually loose-lipped sister. "I'm fine, Mom. Just a busy week." I took a bite of the golumki, the familiar taste of my childhood momentarily distracting me from the conversation I knew was coming. Dinner progressed, with the usual family dynamics. Dad commenting on the game, Mom trying to serve second and third helpings, the twins getting increasingly restless, and John making polite but minimal conversation. Melissa kept shooting me looks, silently asking whether I was going to say anything. Finally, as Mom served dessert, her famous Sarlotka Polish apple pie, I cleared my throat. "I have some news to share," I began, my voice steadier than I expected. The table fell silent. Even the twins looked up from their games. "I'm pregnant." The silence deepened, stretching uncomfortably until my father broke it with a short, disbelieving laugh. "Very funny, Karolina," he said, turning back to his game. "I'm serious, Dad. I'm about 6 weeks along." My mother's hand flew to her chest. But you're not even dating anyone. How can this be?" "I met someone while I was in Costa Rica," I explained, keeping my tone matter of fact. It wasn't planned, obviously. "Costa Rica?" My father's attention was fully on me now, the baseball game forgotten. "You mean that vacation you took? You got pregnant from a vacation fling?" His voice rose with each question. "Stefan, lower your voice," my mother hissed, glancing at the twins, who were watching the adult drama unfold with fascination. "Boys, why don't you go play in the basement?" John suggested, and for once, they didn't argue, sensing the tension in the room. After they left, my father leaned forward, his expression a mixture of anger and confusion. "Karolina, I don't understand. You are a smart woman. How could you be so irresponsible?" "These things happen, Dad," I said, though I'd been asking myself the same question for days. "So who is this man? Is he coming here? Are you getting married?" My mother's questions tumbled out in rapid succession. "His name is Miguel. He lives in Costa Rica. And no, we're not getting married. He doesn't even know yet." "You haven't told the father?" My mother looked scandalized. "I've been trying to figure things out myself first," I explained, though the truth was I had no idea how to even begin that conversation with a man I'd known for only 2 weeks and hadn't spoken to since. "Well, there's only one sensible solution here," my father said firmly. "You can't have this baby." "Dad!" Melissa exclaimed, surprising me with her objection. "That's Karen's decision." "Don't be naive, Melissa," he retorted. "Your sister is 37, unmarried, with a demanding career. She can't raise a child alone, especially one fathered by some vacation tour guide she'll never see again. Miguel is a marine biologist, I corrected, though it seemed like an insignificant detail in the grand scheme of the conversation. He runs eco-tours as a side business. That doesn't change anything, my father insisted. This is a mistake that can be corrected before it complicates your life. I sat straighter in my chair. Actually, Dad, I'm leaning toward keeping the baby. The ensuing silence was even heavier than before. My mother looked as though she might faint, while my father's face reddened dangerously. Have you lost your mind? He finally managed. What about your job, your life, our reputation in the community? I can adjust my work schedule, I said, though I hadn't thought through the details yet. Plenty of women have careers and children. Not single women with no support system, my mother interjected. Who will help you? Who will watch the baby when you're working late? Have you thought about any of this, Carolina? I'll hire help if I need to, I said, though the thought of leaving my hypothetical child with a stranger made my stomach twist. And I have savings. Those savings are for your retirement, not for raising some mistake. My father's words hit me like a physical blow. This baby is not a mistake, I said quietly but firmly. Unplanned, yes, but not a mistake. My mother began to cry softly, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. Oh, Carolina, what will people say? The Kowalski's daughter having a baby out of wedlock with a man she barely knows. Mom, it's the 21st century, Melissa said gently. No one cares about that stuff anymore. Your Polish community will care, John spoke up for the first time, his tone sympathetic but realistic. You know how traditional they are. He was right. The tight-knit Polish-American community my parents were deeply embedded in was old-fashioned in many ways. There would be talk, disapproval, possibly even ostracism. And it would hurt my parents, who valued their standing in that community. I'm sorry if this disappoints you, I said, looking between my mother and father. But this is happening. I'm having this baby. You always were stubborn, my father muttered, pushing away from the table. Always thinking you know better than everyone else. Stefan, please, my mother pleaded. He ignored her, standing up. I need some air. He walked out, the front door slamming behind him. My mother burst into fresh tears. Now, see what you've done? Your father's heart isn't strong. This kind of stress isn't good for him. Guilt washed over me, followed quickly by anger. I didn't mean to upset him, Mom, but this is my life and my decision. Your decisions affect this family, she snapped with uncharacteristic heat. Always so selfish, Carolina. Always thinking only of yourself. Her words stung, especially because they echoed doubts I'd been battling myself. Was I being selfish? Was I capable of being a good mother? When I'd spent my entire adult life focused primarily on my own goals and needs? I think I should go, I said, standing up. Thank you for dinner. Melissa followed me to the door. They'll come around, she said, though she didn't sound convinced. They just need time to adjust to the idea. And what about you? I asked, suddenly needing to know where my sister stood. Do you think I'm making a huge mistake too? She hesitated, which was answer enough. I think you're underestimating how hard this will be, she finally said. Being a mom changes everything, Karen. And being a single mom? That's a whole other level of difficult. I know it won't be easy, I admitted. But something about this feels right. I can't explain it. She gave me a small smile. Then I'll support whatever you decide, and I'll work on Mom and Dad. I hugged her tightly. Thank you. As I drove home, my family's reactions played on repeat in my mind. I'd expected resistance, but the vehemence of my father's opposition and my mother's tears had shaken me more than I wanted to admit. For the first time, I allowed myself to really imagine what lay ahead. Morning sickness, maternity leave, sleepless nights with a newborn, and eventually raising a child who would look to me for everything. The harbor was shrouded in fog when I arrived. Home, the water and sky blending into a gray void that matched my mood. I stood at my window, watching as a lone boat navigated through the mist, its lights cutting a path through the darkness. That night, I made 2 decisions. First, I would keep this baby. Second, I needed to contact Miguel. Finding Miguel wasn't as difficult as I'd imagined. A quick search on social media led me to his profile. Miguel Alvarez, marine biologist and eco-tour guide based in Tamarindo, Costa Rica. His page was filled with stunning underwater photography and information about marine conservation efforts. Nothing about his posts suggested he was in a relationship, which was a relief. I hadn't considered that complication until now. It took me 3 days to work up the courage to send him a message. I kept it simple. Hi Miguel, it's Karen from Boston. I hope you're well. I need to talk to you about something important. Could we have a video call sometime this week? His response came within hours. Karen, great to hear from you. Sure, how about tomorrow? I'm free after 7 p.m. your time. The next evening, I sat at my dining table, laptop open, heart racing as the call connected. Miguel's face appeared on screen, his familiar smile sending an unexpected wave of warmth through me. Behind him, I could see what looked like a small apartment, bookshelves lined with marine biology texts and framed photographs of ocean scenes. Karen, ¿qué pasa? You look great, he said, his accent just as charming as I remembered. Thanks, Miguel. It's good to see you too. I took a deep breath. There's no easy way to say this, so I'll just be direct. I'm pregnant. His smile froze, then slowly faded as the words registered. Pregnant? Yes. About 7 weeks now. It happened in Costa Rica. He ran a hand through his dark curls, a gesture I remembered from our time together. Wow, I didn't expect... we used protection. Not every time, I reminded him gently. That last night on the beach... Right. He nodded, looking dazed. Right. The beach. He was quiet for a moment, processing. Are you okay? How are you feeling? The genuine concern in his voice loosened something tight in my chest. Physically, I'm fine. Morning sickness is starting to kick in, but otherwise okay. Emotionally, I shrugged. It's been a lot to process, I can imagine. He leaned closer to the screen. What are you thinking? About the pregnancy, I mean. I've decided to keep the baby, I said firmly. But I want to be clear. I'm not expecting anything from you. I just thought you had a right to know. Miguel was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. Thank you for telling me, he finally said. I appreciate that you didn't have to, but you did. You're welcome. Can I ask, why? Why keep it? This must complicate your life significantly. It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself, repeatedly. I'm not entirely sure, I admitted. Part of it is my age. At 37, this might be my only chance at motherhood. And part of it is just a feeling, like this was meant to happen. He nodded slowly. I understand. Then, after another pause, I want to be involved. That surprised me. Miguel, you live in Costa Rica. Your life is there. And my child will be in Boston. That doesn't mean I can't be part of their life. His determination reminded me of why I'd been drawn to him in the first place. His passion and sincerity were compelling. We can figure out the logistics, visits, video calls, co-parenting across continents. It's not ideal, but it's possible. You've thought about this for all of 5 minutes, I said, skeptical. This is a lifetime commitment. Some decisions don't need hours of deliberation, Karen. When it's right, you know. He smiled, a warm, genuine expression that reached his eyes. Besides, I always wanted to be a father someday. The timing and circumstances are unexpected, but the desire was already there. I felt tears threatening and blinked them back. Damn pregnancy hormones. Let's take this one step at a time, I suggested. There's still a lot to figure out. Agreed. But know this, you're not alone in this, Karen. Whatever form our arrangement takes, I want to be there for both of you. After we disconnected, I sat staring at my dark computer screen, trying to process what had just happened. I'd expected shock, maybe resistance or denial. I hadn't expected immediate acceptance and a desire to be involved. It was simultaneously comforting and terrifying. Could we really make this work? Co-parenting with someone who lived over 2,000 miles away, someone I barely knew beyond a 2-week vacation romance? The following weeks were a blur of doctor's appointments, morning sickness, which cruelly lasted all day, and trying to maintain my work performance while constantly fighting exhaustion. I told my boss about the pregnancy at the 12-week mark, earlier than I'd planned, because my frequent bathroom breaks and sudden aversion to the smell of the office coffee were becoming noticeable. To my relief, Diane was supportive. Congratulations. Karen, we'll need to start planning your maternity leave and figuring out coverage for your projects, but we've got time. How are you feeling? Like I've been hit by a truck most days, I admitted. But the doctor says that's normal for the first trimester. It gets better, she assured me. My morning sickness disappeared completely around week 16 with both my kids. Miguel and I spoke weekly via video call. He peppered me with questions about doctor's appointments and how I was feeling, and shared articles about fetal development that he'd been researching. It was sweet and unexpected. We were developing a friendship that was entirely different from our brief romance, deeper in some ways, more complicated in others. He started setting aside money for child support and researching the legal aspects of international co-parenting. Meanwhile, my relationship with my parents deteriorated. After the disastrous dinner announcement, they seemed to be alternating between pretending the pregnancy wasn't happening and trying to talk me out of it. My mother called daily with veiled suggestions. Mrs. Wisniewski's daughter works for a women's clinic, she mentioned casually one evening. Very discreet, very professional. If you need her number, Mom, I'm not having an abortion, I said, firmly. I'm almost through my first trimester. This is happening. But Carolina, you haven't thought this through. Your father and I are worried sick about you. I appreciate your concern, but I've made my decision. The conversation ended the same way it always did, with my mother sighing heavily and saying she'd pray for me, and me feeling equal parts guilty and frustrated. Melissa, true to her word, was trying to support me while also playing mediator between me and our parents. Give them time, she advised during one of our lunch dates. This is a big adjustment for them. It's a bigger adjustment for me, I pointed out, gesturing to my slightly rounded belly. I'm the one whose body and life are changing completely. I know, but they're old school, Karen. In their world, this isn't how things are supposed to happen. I picked at my salad, the only food that didn't trigger my nausea that day. And what about your world? You've been pretty quiet about your own thoughts on all this. She hesitated. Honestly, I'm worried about you. Not because I think you can't handle motherhood. You can handle anything you set your mind to. But because I know how hard it is, even with a partner. She glanced toward the window, watching people pass by on the sidewalk outside. John and I almost split up during the twins' first year. The sleep deprivation, the constant demands, the way your relationship becomes all about the babies. It's intense. Miguel wants to be involved, I told her. We're working on a co-parenting plan. From Costa Rica? She looked skeptical. Long-distance parenting isn't the same as having someone there at 3 a.m. when the baby won't stop crying and you're so tired you can barely see straight. She wasn't wrong, and her words added to the anxiety that occasionally crept in at night, when I couldn't sleep. But then I would feel a flutter in my belly, the baby moving, a sensation that had recently started and still amazed me, and my resolve would strengthen again. As my second trimester progressed, my body changed dramatically. My slim, athletic build gave way to rounded curves and a prominent belly. Shopping for maternity clothes was a surreal experience. Nothing in my carefully curated wardrobe fit anymore, and I found myself reluctantly purchasing flowing tops and pants with elastic waistbands. Work became more challenging as my pregnancy advanced. Boston was experiencing a heat wave that summer, and despite the office air conditioning, I was constantly overheated and uncomfortable. My feet swelled in the humidity, making my professional heels unwearable, and my concentration suffered from broken sleep. Miguel continued to be a steady, supportive presence through our weekly calls. He'd started learning about birthing methods and infant care, often sharing insights or asking thoughtful questions about my birth plan. We decided to find out the baby's sex during my 20-week anatomy scan, both of us too practical to want to wait for a surprise. "It's a boy," the ultrasound technician announced, moving the probe across my gel-covered belly. "And everything looks perfect. Strong heartbeat, all measurements on track." I stared at the screen, at the clear image of a tiny human with a distinct profile, thumb near his mouth. My son. Tears spilled down my cheeks before I could stop them. "Would you like me to print some pictures for you?" the technician asked kindly, offering me a tissue. "Yes, please," I managed. "Several copies." That night, I video called Miguel with the news and held up the ultrasound images to the camera. A boy! His face lit up with a smile so wide it made my heart ache a little. "Look at him. He has your nose." "You can barely see his nose," I laughed, but secretly pleased at his enthusiasm. "Have you thought about names?" he asked. "A few," I admitted. "But nothing feels right yet. In my family, there's a tradition of naming boys after their grandfathers," Miguel said. "My father is Ethan. It's not a typical Costa Rican name. My grandfather was American, but I've always liked it." "Ethan," I repeated, testing the name. "Ethan Alvarez." "Or Ethan Matthews Alvarez," Miguel suggested, incorporating my surname. "Unless you prefer just Matthews?" The question of the baby's surname hadn't occurred to me yet. "Hyphenated feels right," I decided, to honor both his parents. Miguel nodded, looking pleased. "Ethan Matthews Alvarez, our son." Our son. The phrase lingered in my mind long after we ended the call. For all the anxiety and uncertainty of the past months, there was also this, a connection forming, a family taking shape, unconventional as it might be. The next Sunday dinner at my parents' house was tense. I'd started showing enough that my pregnancy was unmistakable, even in loose clothing. My mother's eyes filled with tears when she saw me, though she quickly blinked them away and busied herself with serving food. My father was polite but distant, asking about work, but carefully avoiding any mention of the baby. It was Melissa's 10-year-old sons who broke the ice, their childhood innocence cutting through the adult tension. "Aunt Karen, is there really? And a baby in your tummy?" Tyler asked, staring curiously at my rounded middle. "There is," I confirmed with a smile. "Your little cousin." "Cool," his twin Ryan chimed in. "Is it a boy or a girl?" "It's a boy," I told them, deliberately making eye contact with my parents. "His name is Ethan." "You've named it already?" my mother asked, the first direct reference she'd made to the pregnancy in weeks. "Him, Mom, not it." And yes, Miguel and I decided on Ethan. "Miguel," my father repeated, the name sounding foreign and unwelcome on his tongue. "The father is still involved then?" "He is," I said firmly. "We're working on a co-parenting arrangement." "From another country? That hardly seems practical," my father scoffed. Before I could respond, Tyler piped up again. "Can we teach him how to play baseball when he gets bigger, Aunt Karen?" The simple question, so full of acceptance and excitement, made my throat tight with emotion. "Of course you can," I managed. "He'll love having big cousins to show him things." My mother's expression softened slightly at this exchange. Later, as I was helping her clear the dishes, she hesitantly touched my arm. You're really going through with this, aren't you? Yes, Mom. I am. She sighed deeply. Then I suppose we should start getting used to the idea of being grandparents again. It wasn't enthusiastic acceptance, but it was something, a small crack in the wall of disapproval they'd built. That night, I received a text from Melissa. Progress. Mom asked me if I still had the twins' baby clothes in storage. Think she's coming around. I smiled at the message, hope rising that perhaps my parents would eventually embrace their grandson, even if they couldn't fully approve of how he came into the world. As my due date approached, my anxiety increased. The nursery was ready. A former guest bedroom now painted a soft sage green with a white crib and changing table. But I didn't feel ready. How could anyone truly be prepared for such a life-altering event? Miguel had been saving for a plane ticket to be present for the birth. We'd discussed the logistics extensively. He would stay in a hotel nearby, be at the hospital for the delivery, and remain in Boston for 2 weeks to help with the newborn before returning to Costa Rica. After that, we'd arranged for him to visit for a week every 2 months, with daily video calls in between. It seemed like a workable plan, but as my due date grew closer, doubts crept in. What if Miguel changed his mind once the reality of fatherhood hit him? What if the distance proved too great an obstacle for meaningful co-parenting? What if I simply wasn't cut out for motherhood? My water broke 3 days before my scheduled induction, as I was finishing up loose ends at work. The sensation was unmistakable. A sudden gush of warm fluid that left me standing in shock beside my desk, thankful I'd opted for a dress that day. Karen? My assistant, Jen, looked at me with concern. Are you okay? My water just broke, I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. Could you call me a cab and let Diane know I'm starting my leave a few days early? Jen's eyes widened. Oh my God, shouldn't I call an ambulance? No, I assured her, gathering my things. There's plenty of time. First babies usually take hours to arrive. I was right about that. 22 hours later, after what felt like an eternity of pain, exhaustion, and moments of doubt that I could actually do this, Ethan Matthews Alvarez made his entrance into the world at 7:14 a.m. on a crisp October morning. It's a boy, the doctor announced, placing a squirming, wet bundle on my chest. A healthy baby boy. I stared down at him in wonder. His scrunched red face, his shock of dark hair, his tiny fists already pummeling the air as he protested his abrupt transition into the world. He was beautiful, perfect. Mine. Miguel, who had arrived just in time for the final hours of labor, stood beside the bed, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. He's amazing, he whispered, reaching out to touch Ethan's tiny hand. You're amazing, Karen. Thank you for this gift. In that moment, all the uncertainty, all the family tension, all the logistical complications seemed insignificant compared to the miracle of this new life we'd created. The first few weeks with Ethan were a blur of sleepless nights, breastfeeding struggles, and a strange new reality where time was measured, not in hours or days but in feeding cycles and diaper changes. Miguel was a godsend during those initial 2 weeks, taking night shifts so I could sleep, handling diaper duty with surprising competence, and making sure I ate regularly when I was too exhausted to remember myself. When it came time for him to return to Costa Rica, we both dreaded the separation. It's not goodbye, he reminded me as we stood in my apartment, Ethan sleeping peacefully in his arms. It's just until next time. I know, I said, fighting back tears. Postpartum hormones were making my emotions volatile, but the sadness was genuine. Miguel had proven himself to be not just a dedicated father, but a true friend and partner in this challenging new journey. We'll video call tomorrow, and every day after. He carefully transferred Ethan to my arms, then leaned in to kiss the baby's forehead. Be good for your mama, little man. Papa will see you soon. After he left, The reality of single motherhood hit me full force. Despite all my research and preparation, nothing had truly readied me for the isolation and overwhelming responsibility of caring for a newborn alone. My body was still healing, my emotions raw, and Ethan seemed to sense the shift, becoming fussier and more difficult to console. Melissa was my lifeline during this period, stopping by regularly with home-cooked meals and offering to hold Ethan, so I could shower or nap. John brought the twins over on weekends, their energy and excitement about their baby cousin providing a welcome distraction from the monotony of newborn care. My parents, however, remained distant. They had visited the hospital briefly after Ethan's birth, my mother cooing appropriately over the baby while my father stood awkwardly at the foot of the bed. But they declined my invitations to visit at home, citing various excuses that grew, increasingly transparent. "They're still adjusting," Melissa said diplomatically when I expressed hurt over their absence. "Give them time." But time was passing, and Ethan was growing quickly, changing from a wrinkled newborn to a more alert, responsive infant with distinct features: Miguel's dark hair and olive complexion, my green eyes and determined chin. And my parents were missing it all. The unspoken divide deepened when, at 6 weeks postpartum, Melissa organized a small blessing ceremony for Ethan. Not a formal baptism, I wasn't particularly religious, despite my Catholic upbringing, but a gathering of close friends to welcome him to the world. My parents declined to attend, my father citing a previous commitment, and my mother claiming she wasn't feeling well. "I don't understand," I confessed to Melissa after the ceremony, as we sat in my living room watching friends coo over Ethan. "They adore your boys. Why can't they accept Ethan?" Melissa sighed, swirling the wine in her glass. "It's complicated. I think they're still holding out hope that this is temporary, that you'll realize how hard single motherhood is and change your mind." "Change my mind? What does that even mean at this point? Ethan is here. He exists." She looked uncomfortable. "They've been talking about adoption. They think you should consider giving him to a proper family with 2 parents. I felt as though I'd been slapped. "Are you serious? They want me to give away my son?" "I'm just telling you what they've said to me," Melissa defended, raising her hands. "I don't agree with them, Karen. You know that." I looked across the room at Ethan, now, sleeping peacefully in my friend Sarah's arms. The thought of giving him up was inconceivable, a physical pain in my chest. "They're never going to meet him, are they? Not really. Not as their grandson." "They might surprise you," Melissa said, but her tone lacked conviction. The conversation lingered in my mind for days afterward, a growing resentment building alongside my exhaustion. I had always been the difficult daughter, too independent, too career-focused, too unwilling to follow the traditional path my parents had envisioned. But to reject their own grandson because of their disapproval of me, that was a level of rejection I hadn't anticipated. When Ethan was 3 months old, my maternity leave nearing its end, Melissa asked if I would bring him to Sunday dinner. "The boys miss you," she said, "and it would be good for Mom and Dad to spend time with Ethan." I hesitated. "I don't want to subject him to their disapproval, Mel." "They won't say anything negative in front of him," she assured me. "And maybe seeing him regularly will help them accept the situation." Reluctantly, I agreed. The night before the dinner, I spent hours preparing, packing Ethan's diaper bag with every possible item he might need, selecting an outfit that made him look particularly adorable, and rehearsing responses to potential criticism from my parents. Sunday arrived, and I drove to Dorchester with a knot of anxiety in my stomach. Ethan, blissfully unaware of the tension, babbled happily in his car seat, a recent development that still made my heart melt every time. My mother answered the door, her eyes immediately going to Ethan in his carrier. "Oh," she said softly, "he's gotten so big." "Babies tend to do that," I replied, trying to keep my tone light as I stepped inside. The house was unusually quiet. "Where is everyone?" "Your father is watching the game in the den," Melissa called. The boys have a stomach bug, so they're staying home. John came to help with dinner, though. She led me into the living room, hovering as I settled Ethan on the sofa and began unpacking his things. "Would you like to hold him?" I offered, noting how she kept glancing at him. She hesitated, then nodded, reaching out her arms with a practiced grandmother's expertise. Ethan went to her willingly, studying her face with his solemn green eyes before breaking into a gummy smile. "Oh," my mother breathed again, her expression softening. "He's smiling now." "Just started last week," I confirmed, watching them carefully. "He's very social, loves people." "He looks like you did at this age," she observed. Same curious expression. It was the first genuine connection she'd shown, and I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe Melissa was right. Maybe time and exposure were all they needed. My father's entrance dampened that hope somewhat. He nodded a greeting to me, but made no move to approach Ethan, instead announcing that dinner was ready. Throughout the meal, he directed his conversation, primarily to John, discussing baseball stats and recent games, while pointedly avoiding looking at the baby carrier where Ethan napped beside my chair. After dinner, as we settled in the living room for coffee, Ethan woke and began fussing. I recognized his hungry cry and excused myself to nurse him, retreating to my old bedroom for privacy. As I sat in the familiar space, now stripped of most of my teenage belongings and converted to a generic guest room, I could hear the murmur of conversation from the living room. I hadn't intended to eavesdrop, but when I heard my name, I found myself straining to listen. "Still think Karen made a huge mistake," my father was saying, his voice low but distinct. "That child will be a burden to her for the rest of her life." "Stefan, please," my mother's voice anxious. "It's true, Magda. She had such potential. A good career, financial stability. Now look at her, exhausted, overwhelmed, her life revolving around a baby she never planned for. The baby is innocent in all this," John's voice, surprisingly firm, "and Karen seems to be managing well. For now," my father countered. "But what about when she wants to date again? What man wants to take on another man's child? And the expenses. Children cost a fortune, college alone these days." "Karen's smart with money," Melissa's voice. "When had she arrived? And she's not asking for help." "Not yet," my father said darkly. "But mark my words, this situation will become our burden eventually. She'll realize she can't do it alone and come asking for babysitting, money, housing even. That's how these things go." "I regret that she didn't consider adoption more seriously," my mother added softly. "A child needs two parents, a proper family." "It's her body, her choice," Melissa argued, echoing words I'd repeated throughout my pregnancy. "And Ethan is her son, our family. A son with a father thousands of miles away, who she barely knows." My father scoffed. "That's not a family. That's a complication, a lifelong burden." I'd heard enough. With shaking hands, I finished nursing Ethan and composed myself before returning to the living room. The conversation shifted immediately to innocent topics: the weather, John's work, Melissa's plans for the twins' birthday party. But I couldn't unhear what had been said, couldn't ignore the revelation that even now, 3 months after Ethan's birth, my parents viewed him as a burden, a mistake, a regrettable complication in my life and potentially theirs. I made our excuses shortly afterward, claiming Ethan needed his bedtime routine. As I buckled him into his car seat, my mother hovered anxiously. "Will you come next Sunday?" she asked. "The boys should be better by then. They'd love to see the baby." I couldn't bring myself to commit. "I'll let you know," I said vaguely. My schedule is pretty full these days. Back in my apartment, after settling Ethan in his crib, I curled up on my sofa and finally allowed the tears to come. The hurt was profound, not just for myself, but for my son, who deserved to be cherished and celebrated by his family, not whispered about as a burden. I called Miguel, needing to connect with someone who unequivocally loved Ethan. They see him as a mistake, I said, after explaining what I'd overheard. Their own grandson. Miguel's face on the screen was sympathetic but firm. Then it's their loss, Karen. Ethan is perfect, and anyone who can't see that doesn't deserve to be in his life. But they're his grandparents, I protested. Family is important. Family is who loves you, Miguel corrected gently. Who supports you and celebrates you? DNA alone doesn't make someone family. His words resonated with something deep inside me, a truth I'd been avoiding. My parents' conditional acceptance, their judgment, their inability to separate their disappointment in my choices from their relationship with their grandson. These were not qualities I wanted influencing Ethan as he grew. I think I need to take a step back from them, I said slowly. At least until they can accept Ethan for who he is, not what they think he represents. Miguel nodded. That seems wise. And remember, he has family who adore him. Me, my parents, they're already planning their first trip to meet him. My sisters are knitting baby clothes. You're not alone in this, Karen. The reminder was comforting. Though unconventional, we were building a network of love around our son, one that crossed continents and defied traditional structures, but was no less real or meaningful for it. Over the following months, I limited my contact with my parents to brief, polite phone calls. I still took Ethan to Melissa's house regularly, maintaining the relationship with my sister, her husband, and especially their sons, who adored their baby cousin. But I declined Sunday dinners and family gatherings where my parents would be present, unwilling to expose Ethan to their underlying disapproval. Miguel visited as planned when Ethan was 4 months old, and again at 6 months. Each visit strengthening the bond between father and son and deepening our own partnership as co-parents. We developed smoothly into a team, our communication direct and effective, our focus always on what was best for Ethan. My return to work brought new challenges. I'd arranged a flexible schedule, working from home 2 days a week and finding a highly recommended daycare center for the remaining 3 days. The transition was difficult. Leaving Ethan felt like leaving a part of myself behind, and I spent those first days checking my phone constantly for updates from the daycare. But gradually, we settled into a routine. Ethan thrived at daycare, his social nature evident in how quickly he became a favorite among the staff. I found I was able to focus during work hours, knowing he was well cared for, and our evenings and work-from-home days became precious time for bonding. As Ethan approached his first birthday, Melissa suggested a small celebration at her house. "The boys are dying to help him unwrap presents," she said. "And it's neutral territory. Mom and Dad can come if you're comfortable with that, but it's not their house, so you set the terms." After consideration, I agreed. It had been months since my parents had seen Ethan in person, and despite everything, I still hoped for some kind of reconciliation, some acceptance that would allow them to be grandparents to him in the true sense of the word. The day of the party arrived, a crisp autumn Saturday that mirrored the day of Ethan's birth a year earlier. He was walking now, unsteady but determined, with a vocabulary of about 10 words, including mama and dada, the latter said during video calls with Miguel, who couldn't make it for the birthday but had sent a mountain of presents. My parents arrived shortly after we did, my mother carrying a gift bag while my father stood slightly behind her, his expression unreadable. Ethan was playing with his cousins on the living room floor, his dark curls bobbing as he laughed at their antics. "There's the birthday boy," my mother said, her voice overly bright. "Look how big he's gotten, Stefan." My father nodded, his eyes briefly meeting mine before looking away. "He looks well." It wasn't much, but it was more acknowledgement than he'd shown in months. I chose to see it as progress. The party proceeded with cake, most of which ended up on Ethan's face and in his hair, presents, which fascinated him less than the wrapping paper, and the chaotic energy of the twins, who had appointed themselves official entertainers for their cousin. Throughout it all, my parents remained on the periphery, watching but not fully engaging, making polite conversation but keeping an emotional distance. As I was packing up Ethan's gifts, preparing to head home for his nap, my mother approached, hesitantly. "He seems happy," she observed. "You're doing a good job with him." The compliment, small as it was, caught me off guard. "Thank you, Mom. He is happy. He's a joy, actually." She nodded, fidgeting with her wedding ring, a nervous habit I recognized from childhood. "Your father and I have been talking. We'd like to see more of you both, if you're willing." Hope flared briefly, then dimmed as I remembered their hurtful words. "I'd like that," I said cautiously. "But I need to know that you accept Ethan, not tolerate him, not see him as some burden or mistake, but truly accept him as your grandson." She had the grace to look ashamed. "Those were unfortunate words. Your father was upset, worried for you." "That doesn't excuse it," I said firmly. "And I notice he's not the one having this conversation." She glanced across the room where my father was helping the twins set up a new toy, studiously avoiding our direction. "He's stubborn, like someone else I know." A small smile. "But he's coming around. He asks about Ethan, you know. When you send pictures to Melissa, she shows us. He notices things, how he's growing, what new skills he's developing." It was something. I supposed, a thawing, if not a complete melt. "I'll think about it," I promised. "But I need you both to understand that Ethan is my priority now. His well-being, his happiness, his sense of being loved and wanted, those come before anyone's feelings about how he came into the world." "I understand," she said softly. "And I hope you know, Carolina, that despite our reservations, we do love you. We want you to be happy." "I am happy, Mom," I told her, looking over at Ethan, who was now dozing against Melissa's shoulder, party hat askew on his curly head. "Happier than I've ever been." And it was true. For all the challenges, all the sleepless nights and logistical complications, all the judgment and readjustments, these past months had been the most fulfilling of my life. Ethan had brought a depth and meaning to my existence that I hadn't known was missing. That evening, after Ethan was asleep in his crib, I stood at my living room window, looking out at the harbor lights. A year ago, I'd stood in this same spot, newly pregnant and terrified, wondering if I was making the biggest mistake of my life. Now I couldn't imagine my life any other way. My phone pinged with a text from Melissa. "Mom asked for your banana bread recipe. Said Ethan seemed to like it at the party." "Small steps?" I smiled, typing back. "Small steps." A video call notification appeared. Miguel, right on schedule for Ethan's bedtime call, even though Ethan was already asleep. I accepted the call, settling onto the sofa with my phone. "How was the party?" he asked immediately. "Did he like my presents?" "The stuffed toucan was a hit," I assured him. "Though I think the wrapping paper was his favorite part of any gift." Miguel laughed, the sound warming me even across thousands of miles. "Classic 1-year-old. How were your parents?" "Civil," I said after a moment's consideration. "Maybe even a little thawed. My mother, at least." "Good. That's progress." We chatted. For a while longer, discussing Miguel's upcoming visit for Christmas and our plans for the holiday. As we were about to sign off, he paused, his expression turning serious. "Karen, I've been thinking a lot about our arrangement." My heart skipped. Was he having second thoughts about our co-parenting setup? "What about it?" "It's working well, but I can't help feeling I'm missing too much. His first steps, his first words. Video calls aren't the same as being there." "I know," I said sympathetically. "But we're making the best of a complicated situation." "What if we uncomplicated it?" he asked. "What if I moved to Boston?" I stared at him, certain I'd misheard. "Move here, but your work, your life in Costa Rica." "There are marine research opportunities in Massachusetts," he said, clearly having thought this through. "The New England Aquarium has a robust conservation program. I've already reached out to some contacts there." "Miguel, this is a huge decision. Are you sure?" I'm sure about Ethan, he said simply. And I'm sure about us, not romantically necessarily, but as a team. We're good together, Karen. We parent well together. And I want to be a daily presence in his life, not just a visitor every few months. The prospect was both thrilling and terrifying. What would this look like, practically speaking? Would you want shared custody? Living arrangements? We'd figure it out, he said with the easy confidence that had first attracted me to him. Separate homes, at least initially, but close enough that we can both be actively involved in his day-to-day life. We could even consider a nanny share to reduce childcare costs. It made sense in a way that surprised me, and the thought of having Miguel nearby, of Ethan having both his parents regularly present in his life, was undeniably appealing. Let's explore it, I agreed. But slowly, carefully. This would be a big change for all of us. His smile was warm, relieved. That's all I'm asking for now, a serious exploration of the possibility. After we hung up, I checked on Ethan one more time, watching his peaceful sleep for a moment before returning to the living room. The harbor was dark now, the water reflecting the city lights like scattered stars. My life had taken the most unexpected turn, leading me down a path I never would have chosen for myself. Yet here I was, navigating single motherhood, international co-parenting, family tensions, and career balancing with a confidence I wouldn't have predicted. Ethan hadn't been planned, but he was no mistake, not a burden, but a blessing. Not a complication, but a clarification of what truly mattered. My phone pinged again, another text from Melissa. Forgot to tell you, Dad mentioned setting up a college fund for E. Said education is important. Definitely progress. I smiled, feeling a knot of tension I'd carried for months begin to loosen. Progress indeed. Small steps toward acceptance, toward family healing, toward a future where my son would be surrounded by love from all directions. For now, though, we had each other. Ethan and me, plus Miguel across the miles but growing closer. A family of our own making, unconventional but unquestionably real, and that was enough, more than enough. It was everything.